I'm talking with Dr. Lawrence LeShan. So could you tell me briefly how you got interested in parapsychology?
I got interested in parapsychology through a fundamental mistake. I'd been working with terminal cancer patients for a very long time. I was completely exhausted. I needed a rest. I had an idea for a short, simple project would take me a couple of months to do. You see, there was a diagnosis that had never been made. There was a syndrome of people who had very good minds and kept functioning very well, like William James and Gardner Murphy, but who had a small hole in their egos. They believed in this nonsense about the paranormal. They believed in things like telepathy, but they were not doing very good work, showing that the ego was intact, except for this one small hole where they believed in obvious nonsense. I was going to name and study that syndrome. That's the way you become famous. You get a disease named after you, Hansen's disease, von Recklinghausen disease, LeShan syndrome, I would call it. So I was out of foundation money. My grant was up in a year, so I went to a new foundation, and I've got to study to once and for all dispose of these charlatans who go around talking about the paranormal. They thought it's a great idea. They gave me a grant. It's a small grant, but a one-year grant to study LeShan syndrome. And so I did what I do in a case like that. First, go back in the literature as far as you can. For me, I generally wind up studying with the classical Greeks. And then find somebody who does it. Find a psychic, so-called. So I had to find somebody who called himself a psychic. I asked around, and I heard about this very famous psychic, so-called, psychic in quotes, named Eileen Garrett. I called up, went to see her. I liked what I had to see. She was very down to earth and solid, but a lot of air of mystery around her. I found out that it was a meeting made in heaven. We needed each other. She needed somebody to watch her while she was in trance to make sure she did not cheat, fish for no information. She knew she didn't fish while she was awake, but she was so trained that she couldn't remember anything that happened in trance. The reason for that, I found out later, was because it scared her. She wasn't afraid of the paranormal, but she wanted to make sure it was the paranormal. Just as when she went to bed at night, she always had a nightlight on. Not because she was frightened of the dark anyway. She was frightened of those hours when she woke up and it was twilight, half light, half dark. She couldn't tell where the information was coming from, paranormal or sensory. So she wanted somebody with credentials, a PhD from University of Chicago, like me. And I wanted a quack like her to study. And then she blew my mind. She started pulling information out of the air. And under my conditions. I set up tests, experiments. She passed them with flying colors. Often not even apparently working at it. She'd use what she called waking psychometry. She'd hold something or a thought and free associate or go into trance. That completely confused me. She was not a quack. So I went back to the foundation and I said, we were wrong, 180 degrees wrong. There is such a thing as the paranormal. I've seen it. I've tested it. It's real. And if it's real, it's the most important thing a psychologist could be studying. I want another grant, just the opposite of the grant you gave me. They went along with it. They gave me a grant. And so I started hanging around Eileen. She was very friendly. I tested her in various ways. The first time I tested her, she was cheating, but she didn't know it. She was using what they call a cabana box, which is a box with 5 or 6 sides. You put your arms through long wristlets, and you tell what the person inside is doing. You can see the person from the other side putting their hands over a series of discs we use first, color disc, and they say, I'm holding my hand over the orange disc or the blue disc. She didn't know it, but you could see in her eyeglasses the reflection of what was in the boxes. Fortunately or unfortunately, when we cut out the eyeglasses, she went right on calling the shots. She didn't even notice the difference. But that was the kind of thing I tested her for. So I got to be the person who followed her around, her valet de chambre, or whatever you call it. And she'd call me up and say things like, we're going to look at a haunted house. You want to come along? I'd say sure. We'd get in her lovely chauffeured, air-conditioned car. Lisette will remember that. Lovely way to travel with a marvelous chauffeur who would always find his way around upstate Connecticut, New York. And we go to the haunted house. We never found the haunted house. We went to a number of them. But again, she blew my mind. What she would do is she'd go around sniffing, so to speak. Yeah. She didn't do that, but she could have. She'd go around sniffing the situation, then call the family together and say, you haven't got a paranormal situation here. What you have is a disturbed adolescent. This girl should be going to college, or this girl should be going to some kind of school, working. She did psychiatric interviews. Now, I thought I knew a good deal about interviews before that. I've never watched one done with greater finesse, flexibility, tact, and success. Because when we'd leave, after a couple of hours, the girl would say, yes, I really wanted to go to college, or I did not want to go to college. And the whole family would be changed. I've seen a great deal of psychiatric interviews. I've even done some pretty good ones myself. I've never seen one done with anything like the finesse and skill she had in weaving these families together. It was beautiful.
Can you speak to the difference of Eileen Garrett in her own persona, her own personality? I've heard it referred to as very mercurial, but her own personality versus Eileen Garrett in her, psychic functioning. Was there much
Not really.
difference?
I've never got a sense that there was a real persona who was Eileen Garrett and everybody else was acting. When she was in trance, for example, she really seemed to be a different person. The way the language came out was different. What she said was different in trance with different personalities. So I never found out, I never had the sense that there was a real Eileen Garrett there somewhere. Basically, if you come right down to it, she was a very good businesswoman. She started, I think, to my knowledge, 5 or 6 or 7 new companies, generally publishing companies, but she always seemed to build them and sell them at the right time. But I didn't have a sense that she was hiding her real self. She was being who she was, what the situation called for. I've seen her be very, without being in trance, very sweet, warm, supportive. I've seen her being harsh the other way, cold, hostile, but as a normal person would be relating to these. I don't think I ever saw her.
So she wasn't like the administrator of the foundation, a different person per se behind her imposing mahogany desk at the foundation. I mean, she was pretty much true to herself. I mean, wherever. I mean, she didn't sort of put on the administrative
That's
thing
sort of
versus the psychic.
the feeling I had. She was really being true to herself, who she was at this time. I always wanted to look more carefully at these studies which try to differentiate her in trance and out of trance. Never really spent time looking at them. I've heard they're very interesting, but I never really believed in them until I could find them.
Well, now you have experienced her so often in trance. Could
Yeah.
you speak to the differences, or what was it like talking to Uvani, her so-called gatekeeper, or Abdul Latif? I mean, could you immediately recognize the difference between them, or what was that like, Larry?
Mostly, you started off every interview with Giovanni, who, as I said the other day, had this wonderful greetings. Greetings, Sahib. May your... What was it? I forget.
Something about on your house or something? Was it something?
Yeah, something like that.
Like blessings or
Blessings be upon
Yeah,
you, or
something
something.
like that.
Yeah. And you had a
And I would say, greetings, Giovanni. May your endeavors be fruitful. And then we get to work. But I'd be talking to Giovanni. It was very clear, once this started, who I was talking to.
the Arab guy. I mean, he claimed to be was he like the telephone operator that you would just dial in, get Uvani, and he would say, okay, I want to talk to blah blah, or I want to speak.
No,
How did it work, Larry?
You had to talk why you were there. He would ask, why did you call me?
Uh-huh.
And I would say, give some reason.
Okay.
Generally, very carefully, in the test mode, so being very careful to not give any extra cues that could be, somebody later could say, he figured it out from this. Ordinarily, I would never say. A man vanished. His wife is very worried. Can you help? Ordinarily, I would never say that. I wouldn't mention that he had a wife. He might be gay, or as he walks, or he might be anything. Let it come from her. And it came from her. She could be very accurate. The only time I had a really long conversation with Abdul Latif was the time in the gazebo. We talked for several hours. Or he talked. He said, I have a letter for Eileen, Garrett. I want to give it to you so you can give it to her. And I spent the next 3 hours, or something like that, writing notes. Then went up to the bureau, borrowed a typewriter, and typed up all the notes. And to my everlasting regret, tore up all the notes. This was a personal letter. It was very personal from the beginning. Expressed as he expressed it to a warm letter to a close old friend,
Interesting.
implying, or saying, I don't know, remember, that he knew she'd been having a very hard time. And starting with this in a very sympathetic way. You know the story of Abdul Latif. He was a figment of imagination. He had appeared once before. Eileen appeared on the scene. And that is, I forget, somebody.
Saunders did he appeared with another medium, and there was a book, with Spirit Agency that was edited
In the
by
College
Saunders.
of Psychic Science.
Yes, and he said he'd be back or whatever,
Yeah.
and then he started.
He said, I'm leaving now. I'll be back. There's a new, young, very strong psychic. I'll be back for her. And then he disappeared. I think for quite a long time.
I think a good 5 years. Yeah.
And then he reappeared.
And you know what else he did? When Garrett said that she was going to move to the States, right? In the 40s, apparently, or just before the war, Abdul Latif didn't want to go. I found out in the mystery boxes. So apparently, she said, well, all right, and he bugged off and he started talking, and I have the name of the medium. He started appearing through another medium at the college, right? That lasted for a couple of years, and then Come Home, Lassie, Come Home. Apparently, he didn't like that particular channel, left her, and went back to Mrs. G and was with Mrs. G till the end of her life, which I think is pretty capricious of the controls, that they pick and choose who the instrument is.
This was a weird one.
Yeah, isn't that? Yeah.
It's interesting. The material on him that I heard from Dingwall, who told me that they had found in the material at the Oxford Library.
Bodleian Library.
Bodleian Library.
Yeah.
Material by
Manuscript.
the manuscript by Abdul Latif, who was, according to the material, the personal physician of Saladin.
Right, in the court of Saladin, yeah. It's called Al Maktasir, and I really want to go and actually see that one for myself. Yeah, so that's on my bucket list, yeah.
I hope you do that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That was.
See if we get at least a photograph of him.
Well, I think in Saunders' book there's a reproduction of one of the frontispieces of the actual manuscript. That's why I know the name of it or whatever.
Go along with somebody who can interpret
Exactly.
13th century material.
Yeah. Why did you two click? Why? There were so many people
She
buzzing around. Why do you think
she just had a very bad experience with a psychologist named Ed Gurdon, Garden, who was going to do a paper on her, and he wrote a very ugly paper. I don't recall it now, but it was a very nasty paper on her.
Really?
And it just happened. And when I came into the office, the first person I spoke to was Martin Ebon. And he said, "You've come at a bad time. She's very much off psychologist since the Ed Gurdon affair." But it worked.
Well, yeah, timing is everything. Do you have any specific memories or interactions with Parapsychology Foundation in its early days when you were roaming around, or any specific conference memories or anything that you would like to share? I mean, I'm always amused by that anecdote that you told me about the very mechanized early experimentation between the Pure when you had walkie-talkies.
Oh, God.
I love that. I mean, could you share a bit of that?
Yeah. At that time, there was a general belief in the kooky fields, this was one of them, that people did better under the mind-bending drugs when they were taking some kind of a drug. And they decided to do an experiment. Who decided? I don't know. But Jean Antoine went into town and he came back with a plan. The plan was to have at least 3 psychics, a command post, and highly mechanized. We each had a walkie-talkie, a pad.
Sounds like the early Ghostbusters, Larry. Sounds like the early Ghostbusters. This is the early '60s, yeah. So you had a pad attached by your pocket. You
There
have
you go.
a big, heavy walkie-talkie.
Yeah, and you also had envelopes full of various sequences, and we each assigned a psychic. On the patio was Eileen, loaded up with psilocybin. I think it was
Yeah, I
psilocybin.
think so.
Douglas Johnson, a wonderful psychic. I've never seen anybody who did what he did routinely. When he went into trance, his eyes,
Would look
his,
oriental, no?
yeah, his control was named Chang. He was down by the pool. Another psychic was somewhere. And the 3 of us had stopwatches at 2 o'clock. And I can only speak for myself. There I'm standing by the pool with Eileen, and she's telling me off, saying, "What do you care what's written down? Can't you see, Larry? Can't you see how green the grass is? How beautifully blue the sky?" And then she'd take my list of numbers and tear it up and throw it away. There's Douglas Johnson down by the pool saying, "Don't ask what's on the papers. The world is on the papers. The papers are the world, and the world's on the papers." And I think he tore them up. The third psychic, I don't even remember who she was. The whole thing was a total failure. And it was the end of these elaborate studies of how well you do in the paranormal state of mind. Because if you got a good result, then you're interested in that. If you got a bad result, it was a bad trip. Who cares?
That's
At the end of it, I was saying to the command post, this is experimental 1, just finished with sequence 1, going to sequence 2, taking out the second envelope, getting the same type of result from my.
that's funny.
All I remember is it was a beautiful day.
That's funny. It's funny because that looms large in Stan Krippner's memory also, because in his interview yesterday, he was referencing the same thing. He said something about how he gave the envelope. Where would it be? Where would you derive the most power, or where is this knowledge? Where it's most important to the psychic? And apparently, Garrett grabbed the envelope, held it to her large bosom, as Stan said. But of course, Douglas grabbed the envelope and put it by his crotch. So that's what he remembers.
Who put it by?
Douglas Johnson thought that was, yeah. So that sort of,
Ah,
so that must have
that's
been.
a better story.
Well, I don't know. I think that the two dovetail really well.
Ah,
So, Larry, let me ask you, at Eileen Garrett's death in 1970, did you worry about the fate of the foundation? I mean, did the field, was it a non-entity? I mean, she took off. I mean, was anybody worrying when she passed whether, what would
I
happen?
was out of it by then.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I think I told you, I got my walking papers.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, 4 times. The first 3 times I had to answer. I'd walk in and she'd say, yes, Dr. LeShan, what shall I do for you? And I'd say something to the effect of, Eileen, I don't know what you heard or thought you heard or saw or thought you saw. Look at me with your inner eye to tell the difference. Yes, Larry, come and sit down. The 4th time, it was, yes, Dr. LeShan, what can I do for you? And that was the end of it.
Well, when did you first meet Eileen Coly? And did you know Bob Coly, her husband, our administrative
I never
secretary?
knew Bob Coly. Who was he?
But Eileen, well, my father, but Eileen Coly, known as Babs to the family and her intimates,
I don't
right?
know. She was a very young person at that time.
Right. And she sort of took over after Betha. She worked as Mrs. G's secretary, but if you had been given your papers at that point, that part of the foundation, yeah. Um,
I know in a sense I overlapped between 2 secretaries, Betha Cardone and somebody else.
that older one, Lee Davison, the first one.
No.
Hmm.
No.
Ruth Mueller, I don't know. But in any case, were you surprised that there was a 3rd generation in the mix, meaning me, coming in the foundation? I mean, I remember the first time I met you. Do you remember the first time I met you?
Yeah.
Oh, you were walking, you had a little friend in your pocket. Do you remember that at all?
I remember.
Now do you remember?
I remember the friend.
Yeah, the little friend in the offices of the library. I was about, I don't know, 15. I was visiting, and you, of course, were doing your work, I presume, with Garrett. But you had a little live gerbil in your lapel pocket, and you took it out
I
to
bought
show.
him for you.
Yes, yes, and I forever that forged the bond and my great affection for you ever since. Because
It was mutual.
Really.
I knew that you were a relative.
Mm-hmm.
Much more than that I didn't know.
Well, that gerbil cemented for me a lifetime affection for you, for sure. Do you see any knowing Garrett and having not known Mrs. C all that well, but in attending Parapsychology Foundation conferences after that, and of course knowing me probably the best since I've been sitting at your knee, having you trying to glue me back together, or put me together in the first place. Are there any
I remember a great deal of affection for you. I remember at one point why I came to this conclusion, I don't know. At one point, I came to the conclusion that you were having some kind of trouble.
Mm.
I had no idea what it was. I remember was asking you about it, and you said no, nothing. And that was the end of it.
Mm.
But having a strong impression that there was something bothering you very much. But I don't remember the details as to why that was so.
Mm-hmm.
Except I remember a strong feeling, wishing I could do something about it.
Do you recall
Mark
Martin?
Avon, I remember very
Oh,
clearly.
good, 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 good.
Very common sense, quiet guy, as far as I was concerned. I remember questioning him as to what he was doing, an economist doing in parapsychology. And he said, well, you know, being an economist is a very strange profession. He said, for example, do you know where marmalade comes from? And I said, no, where? He said, it comes from England. Now, there are no oranges in England. They don't grow them there. No sugar grows in England. But the combination is they put together in England, and England is famous for marmalade. That's the kind of job an economist tries to figure out. How come that? And we never got back to the problem of what was the economist doing in parapsychology. But I liked him. He's very steady. When I was with him and Eileen, he was always the quiet one.
Well, maybe it was best to be around the queen, to be subservient or whatever.
He lasted longer than any male around her ever did.
Mm-hmm. That she wasn't sleeping with. Yeah, because Jean Andois was, supposedly, I presume, the love of her life from the 30s on till the end of her life. But he certainly professionally, he weathered the storm the longest, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And what about Alan Angoff?
I just never liked him very much.
Yeah.
I thought Alan Angoff had something sly about him. Certainly, it became clear somehow, though I don't know how it became clear, that he and I were sort of competing in some way. Then I figured it out. Later, I blamed him for putting me on the shit list. I'd seen him do that with Fraser Nickel. Fraser Nickel really loved Eileen. It was as pure a love as I've ever seen in my life. He adored her. And suddenly, she turned against him, and he was out. And I remember seeing that Alan was somehow, in my viewpoint, related to this.
I think he was always professionally jealous, I think, of Ivan, or not say jealous, but certainly watchful of his position and didn't want to lose it. So I think that probably your estimation was correct. And yet he did a lot of good for the foundation when it came to increasing the library. She would send him on expeditions to find other libraries and this and that to augment the collection, because I think he was by trade, apart from a writer, he was a librarian himself. So
I did a little of that.
did you really?
At one point, I was going to Europe. I think it was the first time I'd ever been to Europe. And Eileen or Babs or somebody suggested I look for the lost manuscripts. There was 50 years of manuscripts, of transcripts that were lost. I found them. I don't remember the details, but I found them in a house
Mm-hmm.
Could have been Downton Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't.
Mm.
But somehow was there talking to somebody. Edith and I were together at that point, and somebody mentioned Eileen. Oh yeah, they had a box of her transcripts,
Oh, wow.
and it was down in the basement. It was a tea chest, one of the old chests they shipped tea in. Tinned, the size of a small steamer trunk, full of manuscripts. And I arranged they should ship that to the Parapsychology Foundation. And they vanished. I remember when they came, the scene was put them for the moment down in the cellar
Oh,
because
no.
there was somebody who would use them wrongly. I forget his name.
Gore Munson, maybe? No.
Some guy.
Huh. So they were secreted away in the basement of 57th Street, which would have, I know where this is going, right?
When they came to move the stuff away from 57th Street,
Right.
they never turned up.
There was a large flood when they were building the Solo building, which was at 9 57th Street, down the block. When they were doing all the excavation and the blowing up the thing, they broke a bunch of pipes in the basement of 29 West 57, and a lot of material that was down there because the foundation owned the building was irretrievably lost, which is just criminal, for sure, really.
It was such a romantic way to
Yes,
find them
yeah,
in a tea chest.
really, for sure, for sure. Well, how did your association with the Parapsychology Foundation help your career or research, or was it to the detriment? And what do you think the foundation extended to help the field in general? I mean, did it help you, your association with the PF, or?
No, but it didn't damage me either.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I sort of skated on somehow middle ground, as if I was skating on ground that was somehow safe. Ordinarily, anybody at that time who worked in the field of the paranormal would have a very difficult time getting any new jobs. And at one point, it did damage my getting a job.
It did.
At one point, just once. I was looking for a job at the new school. And I found out later that the job possibility was killed when they looked at my material.
Uh-huh. Because
After,
the medium, the mystic, and the clairvoyant, which is known as what overseas they call it, what clairvoyant, the book is Clairvoyant Reality, is so often pointed to as a classic within the field. So, but I guess if you don't enjoy the field, so big,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, Larry, what in your opinion is the lasting legacy of Parapsychology Foundation with your suggested philosophy of approach for successful guardianship of this legacy? So, does PF have a lasting legacy? And if so, how do you think we can maintain the legacy or guard that particular legacy?
well, that's a big question.
Mm,
That's a question. See, when I came into this field and went back to the foundation, I said, if it's real, it's important. And no psychologist could afford to let it go. You're asking the biggest questions. You know, the big question is, what is a human being? Was ist der Mensch? Kant has three questions, which he says is the basis of all philosophy. What can I know? What ought I to do? What dare I hope? The fourth is, was ist der Mensch? What is a human being? Because really, you're asking those questions. Thinking offhand, it seems to me, if there's a legacy, there's something for the foundation to do. It's to be very clear about the questions being asked. It's so easy. I saw this in the meetings of the Parapsychology Foundation. So easy to get sidetracked into details, ignoring the big questions. If you look at the papers of the Parapsychology Foundation, none of them matter a damn. They're not worth a spit in the ocean. They are not asking the big questions. What is a human being? What are limits, potentials, hopes, fears, dreams? That's the legacy, it seems to me, of the foundation. And I think in her better moments, Eileen knew this. She knew it was not a question of how can you set up one of those boxes used to build to screen out all paranormal influences. Big boxes you build.
Oh, the Faraday cages.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not a question of do you want something further on the electromagnetic unit gradient. That's not important. What is this crazy, wonderful, tragic, comic species we are? Why are we a species that laughs at something funny and weeps at Othello? What is it in us that makes us more than human in the usual sense? Most of the work in psychic research has become parapsychology. The details, making all the mistakes that originally psychology made when it tried to avoid the big questions. Because the big questions are questions you never ask in psychology. You don't ask, what is this crazy, weird species storming the heavens, with, filled with rage against injustice, filled with love for a child? Who is that? You don't ask that in psychology. I had the perfect example of it when I flunked out of Clark University. I got thrown out of Clark University. I came to Clark University with wonderful credentials. I had a master's degree, didn't mean much. But I also had a very good experience in the Army. In the Army, I skated on hallowed ice, the jobs I got. I set up the first brain damage clinic in the United States Army. And had a wonderful experience there. Learned a great deal. Learned, among the things that mostly I didn't know what I was doing. And I flunked out on the final prelim was a 3-hour examination. One question: how are children different from adults? Which is a wonderful question. I answered it. I spoke of flexibility of the ego, etc., etc. And then I said, but the most important thing is they're cuter. They decided I did not belong in psychology. They advised me that there were 4 of us graduate students. The first 3 were nice, nothing muches. They passed through. Me, they advised to leave the field, get out of psychology. You have no place in it. You don't have the intellectual capacity to go on in psychology. If you insist on going on in psychology, you might be able to get into a small southern school and you might get a degree, but we advise against it. Recognize your limitations. So I went to after sulking for 3 days, I went to the University of Chicago. Never had the slightest difficulty. But psychology doesn't answer the big questions. It's afraid of them. Even philosophy tried to hide from them for a while. The philosophy, it keeps coming back, but they tried to hide.
Larry, isn't parapsychology, if there's a fear of psi in parapsychology as well, correct?
Oh, the fear is on 2 levels where I think. I'm just making this up as I'm talking. One is, what does it say that human beings have abilities that will sometimes break time and space? And secondly, what does it say about human beings? Are they devils or angels? Should they drop their wings or their horns? They're terrified. Psychical research has given up the term psychical research and gone to parapsychology, mostly. And you can always get grants for that if you decide to waste your time. You can always count how many red-haired people with blue eyes as, in, in Chicago on a bright sunny day, etc., etc. You can make surveys. You can count cards. You never ask, how are they counting the cards? What makes a man or a woman say, that seems like a circle to me, and that seems like a square? You never ask that question. You make statistics. Anybody can make statistics. I once taught a statistics course, which I was assigned to, and before the other guy could get back from vacation, I had to start the course. As I'm walking down the hall at the University of Nebraska towards the room where I know there'll be 50 new psychology students waiting. We teach them statistics, which I dread, and they dread it. Fortunately, to get there, I had to pass through the art department. And in the middle of the art department, I stopped and I looked at a window and I said, that's how I'm going to teach it. So I walked into the statistics course and I say, we've just changed the department you're taking this course in. This will be a course in art, not in statistics. But if you are making an equation which is not beautiful, which doesn't flow, it's wrong. And that's the judgment. The course only lasted 2 or 3 sessions. It was tremendously successful. The students were involved in learning what was a beautiful curve. Think of it. What's a beautiful curve? What makes it a beautiful curve? Is it that it goes like this? Or what in you responds? You could teach an entire course in statistics, and I nearly did. But you have to ask the bigger questions. Why? What are we reaching for?